few videos ago, I brought up the shared ancestry between Japanese-style action RPGs and the Western isometric style. Blizzard North using an automatic timer to turn the originally turn-based graphical roguelike project into one of the first in its style of action RPGs in the West with Diablo. And Falcom doing something similar with Dragon Slayer, before evolving the gameplay into bump combat and beyond with experimentation. What I didn't mention was that Falcom would end up making an action RPG more generally accepted as the Western style down the line. Within the Dragon Slayer franchise, Falcom made many other series. One of the most well-known sub-series, or sub-series of a sub-series, is the Trail series made within the Legend of Heroes brand. Next to Legend of Heroes, we have Xanadu, which has its own history. Even this particular entry has its own share of history with a different game under the same name being put out for the ill-fated N-Gage. But that's not the version that we are going to focus on though. We're going to look at the PC release of one of the more heavily requested games on the channel, Xanadu Next. Xanadu Next follows two orphans who look to each other like brother and sister, a young scholar and an older knight. The knight had a fall from grace and lost his purpose in life, and the scholar figured exploring a mysterious ruins in a foreign land might help him get motivated to live life again. Unfortunately, shortly after arriving, the knight finds a swift death instead. Thankfully, the head priestess of the town nearby can give him a second chance at life, cheating death, but her healing is only temporary. The only way for him to reclaim his life for his own is if he can get his hands on a sword that's part of legend. A legend related to the ruins of the castle that only appears when the town is covered in a thick fog. With a new purpose and a foot in the grave, he sets out to uncover the secrets of the lost kingdom of Xanadu and find the Dragon Slayer. The story of Xanadu Next isn't going to win any awards, and that's okay. It's pretty straightforward and gives you just enough setup to be motivated to enter those forests and dungeons. Which isn't to say that the story in the game is an excuse plot or an afterthought though. Through most of the game, the story is mostly told through lore, stashed away in menus that unlock after finding old scriptures in dungeons. If you care to read it, it's all really good and certainly a highlight in the game. It's isolated away from the rest of the game though, but it's Falcom world building at its best, and the ancient legends tend to be relevant to what you're about to uncover in your explorations. If you don't care for this style of storytelling, you could easily mistake the game for not having much of a story until the very end of the game, where you might feel confused about how much you just missed. This is fairly common for dungeon crawlers, as they tend to be an isolating experience style of storytelling, and I can imagine people expecting trails or ease might not immediately pick up on it or care for it. That said, the way the game handles its lore and its menus should be instantly familiar to people who have played Ys Book 1 and 2, or even Ys 6. Where you're given pages of text about the fall of a civilization long before the elements of it become important to the immediate story. Falcom's good at world building, and this game is really no exception to that, even if it's not wearing it on its sleeve. Town NPCs do update their text a lot though, giving you an ongoing story in their lives with their own minor arcs. They're not static people with stock text, they're people with their own worries and goals living in this era. Not to the extent of trills or ease, but the small effort does help ground the setting a lot. But let's talk about the main meat of the game, the dungeon crawling and combat. Combat in Xanadu Next is fairly simple. You walk up to enemies and hit them. Hitting them from behind deals more damage, while hitting them from the front gives enemies a higher chance to dodge your attacks. There's special abilities and spells that change some of the combat up too, but we'll get to that in a minute. Xanadu Next is originally meant to be played with a keyboard and mouse, though for all my recorded video I ended up opting for controller support instead. Not that the keyboard and mouse controls are bad by any means, but it's what I prefer. That, and I had a minor problem where the game wouldn't lock my mouse to the window, not even in full screen. I didn't find any fixes for this, but I was intending to play with a controller anyway, so it didn't really matter. When playing with a controller, you definitely feel like this was originally a mouse and keyboard game, as the inputs feel like they're hacked on top of the existing controls. Moving around feels like a left click is made right next to your character to continuously move it in that direction. Something that becomes especially noticeable during the screen transitions when your character accidentally attacks the nearest object because left clicking is both moving and attacking enemies. And you better not be thinking about opening the inventory menu and using the mouse to select items while trying to walk at the same time. The game really does not like this. You have an attack button on the controller, which is basically the left click, and a button to cast your spells, which originally was the right click. This is fine by itself, but at first it feels awkward on a controller because interacting with certain objects in the game requires a right click, so you don't do it by accident, like opening locked doors, which costs a key. Something like this should always be a conscious decision, so I understand why they separated it from the button for movement on a mouse. It feels weird on a controller because using it at the wrong instance makes you cast your spells or abilities, which have limited use as well. It makes more sense on a mouse because you're going to be hovering your cursor over a door when right-clicking, so you're less likely to do it while out of range. But honestly, after the first hour or so, I never had issues with this anymore. There are a number of quirks that the controls have that take some getting used to. Some of those still persist with mouse and keyboard, but they're not exactly deal breakers. Xanadu Next is a bit jank. A bit very jank. And that's something that's going to turn off some people and make others shrug it off because they're okay with what the game sets out to do. Abilities and spells all have a limited amount of uses before you can recharge them at a save point or in town. These points are tracked per ability, so if you run out of points for one, you can always slot in another skill on your hotbar and use that instead. Same with spells, there is no global MP in this game and I'm quite fond of the way that it's handled instead. Instead of spamming spells or refilling up with mana potions, you're not giving too many restorative spells in this game. They exist, but they're rare drops that you won't have too many of until very late into the game. You're put in a position where you have to think about when to use these abilities and spells. Abilities tend to move enemies and mess with their positioning or knock them to the ground. Spells might heal certain enemies and barely do damage to others since they're all tied to elements. So you pick and choose what enemies to prioritize in order to make progress. It makes combat feel like it has more depth to it than both Ys and Diablo stylings of action RPGs, where Ys favors skill and Diablo favors the meta build, and this favors strategy. To add to this, some of the skills you get are passives, and to activate those they have to sit in your active hotbar, making it harder to switch them out during combat. So even though you could learn every skill, you're still limited by a small commitment. The passives aren't just stat boosts either. They can do pretty major stuff like making your backstab stronger, giving elemental damage to your physical attacks, or letting you use shields alongside two-handed weapons. The more skills I unlocked, the harder I found the choices to be, to the point that I ended up having only one usable skill alongside a row of passives near the end. My only problem with the skill system is that you gain them through equipping weapons. Weapons have skills tied to them, and after you gain enough proficiency with a weapon, you permanently keep the skill. A lot of RPGs use these systems, and I've never been the biggest fan of it because it means you have to keep holding on to a junk weapon in order to get that skill you want, gimping your speed of progress to keep more possible abilities unlocked for the future. Thankfully, the proficiency requirement to permanently keep skills is fairly low, so it's not a major issue in this game. And yeah, as you probably noticed, the inventory screen styling is very Diablo. Want to see something even more Diablo? Here's the level up screen. You should feel right at home seeing this if you're a fan of Western action RPGs. There's a few interesting differences here though. First of all, you can only level up in town when talking to the priestess who revived you after the tutorial. Upon applying the stat points, they're still not set in stone. You're free to come back and swap them around as many times as you like until you level up again. Not happy where your stats are going? You're allowed to level down too, to reset your skill points. I didn't really use the soft stats that much, but I found it interesting. Technically, it would mean you could put your stats towards the requirement for a weapon, get the ability you want from it, and get rid of the weapon and change your stats again. But there's no need for this as far as I can tell. Equipment requirements for all the tiers follow one single straightforward path in the game, I was disappointed by this because it meant that I would just put my stats towards whatever the next tier of equipment wanted me to have. I never felt like I had the freedom to build my character stats as I liked because all the gear requirements moved in the same direction with no choice between gear types or character classes. Though, at least I still had some control through the abilities, spells, passives, and guardian cards. After you died at the start of the game, you were kept alive by a ritual tying your soul to a guardian spirit. These bonds are supposed to last a lifetime, but since you already wasted yours, your bonds are loose enough to swap them out. It basically comes down to a passive system away from the weapon skills. You can find guardian cards in dungeons and you can swap between these freely by talking to the priestess in town. The cards can help you boost your weapon proficiency gains, elemental resistances, experience gains, how many times you can cast abilities and spells, and much more. It's a simple system, but the way it's tied back to the setting and lore is a really nice touch. Speaking of control over your character and customization, all gear changes immediately show on your character. Every shield, armor, helmet, and weapon shows on your character model upon equipping it. So maybe they railroaded you because they wanted you to see all these different changes. I quite like seeing my character physically change during my explorations through the dungeons, so I can't complain too much. Variation is always nice to have, and I didn't expect to have this much on the character model. It's a nice way to make progress feel more tangible rather than number goes up. Speaking of variety, the enemy variety is also really good. From skeletons who can survive a mortal blow before getting up again to goblins who buff each other, magic users who heal each other and try to hit you with fireballs from a distance, flying enemies that need to be knocked down with a spell before you can really do anything to them. There's some really strong variety here, and most enemy types have their own patterns that you need to take into account, which is what makes it great when they start getting mixed in larger groups. While backstab baiting is always the best tactic, how you get in there safely is always enough of a question to keep things interesting. Combat isn't the only thing happening in dungeons though. There's some puzzles here, and I don't mean just hitting a switch so a door opens elsewhere sort of puzzle, which tends to be as far as most action RPGs want to push this concept. Now, you'll be doing the pushing in this game. Hope you like pushing boxes around, because that's the thing that happens a lot here, and not just the typical kind of box puzzles either. Hitting a box once halves it in size but locks it in place, making you able to climb on top of it, as you can only go half a block up in one go. Oh, and you can shove blocks up this distance too. I think you can see where this is going. The real busy work in Xanadu Next will usually come from the grind, which is pretty frequent. I am not one to complain about grind too much, and I was fine grinding in most of this game. Most of it anyway. There was one instance fairly early into the game when you're facing a lot of skeleton enemies in the sewers where it did start to get grating. Skeletons need to be killed twice for them to stay dead, only giving experience the second time you kill them. It makes grinding for a level up or two on them feel especially tedious. Spells can accelerate it, but in the early game I didn't have enough to continuously cast them just yet. At the very least, the grinding is usually a good time to also focus on getting those weapon skills and leveling up your guardian cards. So even facing the same enemies over and over for a while, it'll still feel like you're going for more than one goal at a time. What really makes Xanadu Next work though isn't just the combat, the skills, or the lore, it's the atmosphere and the environments. A lot of it really comes together to create this feeling of an unexplored, hostile environment full of mystery. The music is a big part of it too. A lot of the songs are more low-key than they tend to be in E's or trills, setting the mood perfectly. The way the game handles doors, pretty much every door being locked and needing a key, which you can buy from the general store in town, owned by a guy who was hoping to sucker you into adventuring just so you'd buy a lot of them from him, really helps sell this mood of this being a place that nobody has been to before. Well, that and the general design of the areas. Most of the dungeons and forest paths tend to go for a circular route that ends up opening shortcuts back to familiar ground so you can safely go back to town and get back to where you were sooner after restocking keys, potions, and skill points. It makes every area feel a lot more interconnected, and the game world feels a lot less like a sequence of stages or phases in a game and more like a real world. Some of these end up opening up because you hit a switch on the other side, or opened an elevator shaft, or happen to open a door from the right side. Some paths open up because you got a special item that can give you special abilities, like walking underwater or crushing walls, like Dogi. Falcom is really exceptional at setting up boss encounters and building up to them, aren't they? The boss fights themselves are a bit lackluster though. I think the combat, as fun as it is during most of the game, doesn't quite lend itself to bosses too naturally. None of the fights are especially bad or anything. They usually have a simple pattern, and once you figured it out, you're good to go. But they certainly don't stack up to bosses in Ys or even Path of Exile. Still, it's several steps above Diablo 1 and 2 though, and Xanadu Next predates Path of Exile by almost a decade, so that comparison is not really fair. A lot of times, you end up getting special items opening new paths after a boss fight, which leads you to new shortcuts back to town, as well as opening up routes elsewhere in the world. Some lead to progress, others lead to treasure. It makes you feel like you came a long way and achieved a lot without showering praise on you, which is always a nice feeling to get from progression. And in a way, it's also funny because most of your travels through the game pale in comparison to the time spent in the final dungeon, which feels like where most of the actual game takes place. If you think Dharm Tower and Solomon Shrine in Ys 1 and 2 were big, this final dungeon is probably about the same percentage of the game in a much, much longer game. It takes me about 2 hours or so to beat the classic Ys games each, and it took me about 16 hours to beat Xanadu Next. No complaints about length or layout of the final dungeon though. That might go up as one of my favorite final dungeons in a video game. And the ending took me by surprise. It might be my favorite Falcom ending that I've seen. Xanadu Next is a janky and often messy game. At times it manages to feel like a bad PC port of a game that's PC exclusive, especially with its controls. It's harder than the average game, even from its own developers. And the early game pacing is especially rough with how satisfying the late game is. But it's got some really solid combat, a cool setting, and great atmosphere going for it. It's a very love it or hate it kind of game, but in my case, I ended up loving it, and I can absolutely recommend Xanadu Next to anyone who is interested. But yeah, focusing on lore over plot, baiting out backstabs, annoying skeleton archers, leveling up, and a religious female NPC in town who revived you from the brink of death after the tutorial. Level design that loops back on itself with a good use of shortcuts. Ah, you were at my side all along. I know that Xanadu Next came out 4 years prior, but this really reminds me of Demon's Souls.